Notebook 9 Towards the Hell of Verdun. From the 29th of February 1916 to the 26th of April 1916. Part 1. On the last episode, we saw how Barthas went on his first home leave since the beginning of the war, a short affair that only lasted 7 days, and after which he had to rejoin his regiment. His company suffered constant abuse by their captain Croix-Meyreville and their commandant Kansgram, and we saw later how the regiment was then transferred to an attack division at the dangerous Bois de la Folie sector, with no shelters to protect them at the front line and the constant danger of mines exploding under their feet. Barthas's battalion itself was kept in reserve at the ruined town of Mont-Saint-Éloi, and that notebook finished with Barthas and his comrades witnessing how heavy artillery was installed on the top of the nearby hill of Mont-Saint-Éloi, while 3 cemeteries spread on its slopes. Now we continue the story from there. Barthas wrote that each morning dead bodies were brought to that hill from the nearby sectors, and there was nothing sadder than seeing a sickly old horse dragging a cart with 2, 3, or 4 dead poilus, hastily wrapped in tent cloths with their legs hanging limply from the back of the cart, and still wearing their mud-splattered boots. Together with the cart always went a funeral procession, consisting of a chaplain, a soldier seminarian, and 3 or 4 territorials turned into gravediggers. Later, on February 29th, Barthas's battalion left in the evening to relieve one of the battalions at the front lines. Soon the weather, which had looked good during the rest of the day, turned bad during their journey with nasty downpours. The poilus had to cross the swampy plains along paths of muddy, slippery planks. Sometimes men slipped and fell into the cold mud, snow, or some of the flooded ditches and craters that dotted the area, getting completely soaked. After the planks, they had to cross a road where the field kitchens had been installed, and which was a mess of vehicles and all kinds of equipment. After going through that, they finally entered the maze of communication trenches. At the beginning, the trenches were fairly well maintained, but after crossing the second line, they were in lamentable condition. Damaged, flooded, collapsing, the poilus soon had their legs soaked and freezing. Then, without warning or explanation, the poilus were ordered to stop, and their superiors left them alone in one of the trenches-turned canals. A long time passed. Some of the soldiers would occasionally shout, asking why they were not advancing, but no answer came. Finally, the rebellious Parisian Vacher ran out of patience and shouted, "Since things are this way, I'm going back, and I'm spending the night in the first shelter I come across. If you're not all cowards, do as I do." And so Vacher left. Before this, the poilus took counsel, and agreed that they couldn't spend the night there, freezing with mud up to their knees. If no order arrived in 10 minutes, they would do like Vacher. But as soon as they reached this decision, their section chief and the sergeants appeared. They immediately sent 1/3 of the section to guard duty at the outposts, where the men would have to spend 8 hours out of every 24, and then led the rest to a part of the trench where a little bit of firing step could be seen along the wall, with no roof above. This would be their bed when they returned after 8 hours of guard duty. The step was too small for all of them, and there was not even room to store their packs. Throughout the dark night it snowed. The exposed and exhausted men remembered fondly all the previous billets that had been filthy and crumbling, but which in comparison to this were like paradise. It was clear that they would freeze to death if they spent the whole night there. One of them went out to explore and discovered a mine shaft. Immediately all the poilus piled into the tunnel. Engineers were digging at the end of it, and men from the reserve companies were carrying sacks full of earth to the entrance. In the cramped, narrow tunnels, the workers stepped on the poilus, but they tolerated their presence due to compassion. Captain Croix-Merville, however, was not so compassionate. The moment he heard they had occupied a mine shaft, he was infuriated, and forbade them from going back there so as not to bother the workers. And so the poilus were forced to install themselves along that small shelf in a communication trench, with nothing but an improvised roof of their tent cloths that did not stop the rain, the wind, or the cold. This was their resting place after hours of work details and guard duty during those days. The cold was such there that it was impossible to lie down or sit standing up. They had to frequently try and stamp their feet on duckboards to fight frostbite. The captain's solution to battle the cold was not to give the soldiers better meals or an extra ration of wine, but instead give them more and more exhausting work details. And so the soldiers often had to spend 12 hours out of 24 slogging through freezing water. But despite their work, it rained or snowed every day non-stop, and the trench was collapsing all around them. Barthas said that luckily it turned out the sector was calm. If the Germans had bombarded them in those shallow trenches with no shelters, they would have been massacred. He further wrote furiously about the generals who succeeded each other in that sector, and their commanding general. All of them should have known better, yet despite that part of the front having been stable for more than a year, there was not a single metal sheet or plank to protect the soldiers from the rain. The engineers, who could have been working on building useful shelters, instead spent all their time building mines, a task which meant Herculean efforts of digging for 2 months to simply blow up a bit of trench where in most cases there was not a single soul nearby. And still, every day court-martials were carried out to condemn men for uttering doubts about the final victory, or for protesting against the senseless bloodshed. Barthas simply wondered what kind of punishment those inhuman generals deserved for sending so many precious souls to suffering and death. Meanwhile, Barthas and his comrades suffered at the forward outposts. Each man had to stand guard for 4 daylight hours and 4 nighttime hours, while Barthas, as corporal, had to spend 12 hours out of 24 on the outpost, though he said that at least he did not have to keep watch right at the loopholes. Night and day engineers would arrive to listen with their instruments for German mines. When the poilus asked them, the listeners always replied that they did not have to worry, as the mine was off to their left. But at the outpost to their left, they always said that they did not have to worry, as the German mine was off to their right. With these lies, they tried to reassure everybody. At least, Barthas said that during their time there was only one mine detonation. It was a French mine, and the Germans replied to it with a bombardment that probably did far more damage than the mine itself. Meanwhile, on the front line, there were a few individual shelters, mine tunnels, and incomplete listening posts which the poilus on guard duty decided to use after their shifts, despite the constant risk of being buried alive by a mine explosion. The captain tried to forbid them from using them, but to no effect. So furious, he decided to punish the men by forbidding the rationers from bringing food up to the front line. The poilus would have to make the difficult journey back to the second line if they wanted to eat. Barthas wrote that one could see how eagerly the sentinels waited for a cup of coffee in the morning to warm themselves a bit, and how joy lightened their faces when they saw the rationer approach. With the captain's cruel orders, that was all over. As the days continued to pass, the temperature plummeted. Heavy snowfall alternated with heavy downpours, and the trenches flooded. In certain places the water reached over half a meter. In order to move through the trenches, some poilus took off their shoes and rolled up their trousers, while others wrapped their legs with several layers of sandbags. But nothing did much good, and they all ended up soaked to the bone and covered in mud. All this suffering took the soldiers to their limits and led to rebellious spirits. One example of this was one evening when Barthas was at an outpost with 3 sentinels. The darkness was absolute, and the only cover they had against the drifting snow was a small and unstable barrier of frozen earth they had built during the previous day. The men had been looking at their watches with flashlights over 20 times, waiting anxiously for their relief at 8 o'clock. Finally, the hour came, but no relief appeared. A quarter of an hour passed, then half an hour, then 3/4 of an hour, and still nothing. Barthas couldn't leave his post until midnight, but the other soldiers were furious. They declared that they were going to leave Barthas alone if he did not go back to find the replacements. And so Barthas calmly took off his shoes, rolled up his trousers, and marched through the flooded trenches back to the second line. The temperature was around 5 or 6 degrees below zero. He passed the next outpost and saw that they were also without relief. The men had simply given up. The sentinels no longer stood at watch. With a few old planks, some sandbags, and tent cloths, they made a small cabin where they crouched and slept, completely overcome with fatigue. Barthas continued on his way and finally found the second line and their grenadier sergeant. When informed of this, the man was dumbfounded. He had sent the relief detail at 10 minutes to 8. They looked around and finally found the 20 rebels hidden in a mine tunnel, feeling no shame at leaving their comrades to freeze at the outposts. Reluctantly, the sergeant reported this to the captain, who jumped with rage. "Bring them here to me right now," he said. One by one, the men were sent to the shelter before the captain and the commandant, who was presiding like a judge. The captain would ask in a rough voice, "You claim to be sick?" "Yes," was the reply. "Fine. The major will see you. We'll take you to him. If you're not diagnosed as sick, it is a court-martial for you, with the charge of desertion of your post in the face of the enemy. Get out of here." Then the rebels got out, but not one of them dared to go with the medical officer. They knew the captain's threat was no bluff, and so they made their way back to relieve the outposts. Worried about those hints of rebellion, the captain went to the outposts that night, and every night afterwards. His objective was not to encourage or comfort the freezing sentinels, but instead to find faults in their vigilance, to punish them. For this, he would creep up to the men and suddenly snap on his flashlight, another source of discomfort in the guard's life. On March 7th, at 7 in the evening, Barthas was on the entrance to the outpost waiting for the coffee man, who had promised to supply them despite the captain's prohibition, when the captain himself appeared. Barthas saluted him and stood to the side, but instead the captain addressed him directly. "You should be busier than that," he said. "Captain, what do you mean?" asked Barthas. "I mean that I want to see everyone hard at work. How many sentinels are there on guard duty?" "Since it's getting dark, just one, sir. The other 2 are at rest," replied Barthas. "Oh, they're resting, are they? Get them here right away, with shovels." "But, Captain, we haven't had any coffee, and, besides, we cleaned out the trench and the approaches to it as best we could, just this morning." But the captain was unmoved. "I've had enough of your excuses, Corporal. Put these 2 men to work in the trench right away." Barthas desperately tried to explain. The trench was an enfilading fire of a German machine gun, and the last company there had had several wounded. But the captain would hear none of it. "Enough! All you have to do is obey orders." "I also have to obey my conscience," was Barthas's reply. And so they faced each other, one defiant, one exasperated. "Yes or no, Corporal Barthas, will you obey me?" "Captain, I would do what you want, in the dark of night or in thick fog, but while it is still daylight, I am not going to risk the lives of my men needlessly." "Fine," said the furious captain. "You shall be punished." And he left. 2 days later, the Palus received happy news. They were going to be relieved by the English beginning at 8 o'clock that very evening. Then they discovered why. Bad news were coming from Verdun, where a terrible battle had been raging since February, and the English were extending their front to free up French forces to be reassigned, which meant possibly being sent to Verdun. By 5 in the evening they were all ready and waiting for the British to arrive. Suddenly, the sergeant of the day appeared with a piece of paper in his hand, and told Barthas with a sad voice, "Barthas, I have some bad news to tell you." Barthas went pale, expecting perhaps that a tragedy had befallen one of his loved ones, but then he received the paper and read it. "Corporal Barthas is broken in rank and assigned to the 15th Company." That was all. Barthas immediately breathed a sigh of relief and gladly tore off his corporal's stripes and threw them to the mud. He wrote that when one accepted a rank, no matter how small, one became an authority, and in some way complicit with all the terrible deeds of the army. By becoming a simple private again, he regained his independence, and his freedom to hate and condemn the militarism that had brought so much bloodshed. The only thing that saddened him was the change in company, as it meant he would lose some very good friends and comrades he had made over time. A Sergeant Mark had the duty to lead Barthas to his new company immediately. Since they were about to be relieved, Barthas asked the sergeant if he could not convince the captain to postpone his reassignment for the next day, so that they wouldn't have to go through the maze of collapsing trenches flooded with freezing water. Sergeant Mark was not looking forward to that awful journey, so he eagerly presented the request to the captain, but Croix-Meyreville flew into a rage and demanded that they leave immediately. Barthas wrote that this cruel action would have increased his hatred for the captain, if it had been possible for it to grow any larger. And so Barthas and Sergeant Mark had to enter the flooded and freezing trenches, and only reached the 15th Company after 2 hours of painful travel through them. They finally found Lieutenant Breton of the 15th Company, who immediately assigned Barthas to the first squad at hand. It turned out that same day a corporal had been broken in rank and expelled from the 15th Company, because he told a soldier who was being evacuated with frostbitten feet that he was lucky to finally leave the war. During those days there was also another victim, Private Vacher, the headstrong Parisian who had defied the captain so many times before. One snowy day, Vacher made the bad decision of going to eat his soup in a shelter occupied by a machine gun officer right next to Captain Croix-Meyreville's shelter. The machine gun officer told Vacher about the standing orders to keep that staircase clear, but Vacher replied that he was not in the way, and he was only taking shelter for a while. The officer immediately threatened Vacher with punishment, and talked to him worse than to a dog. Vacher got angry and insulted the officer, calling him a toilet seat and a blockhead. Those disrespectful words could get a soldier in big trouble. The officer felt guilty and decided not to pursue the matter, but, unfortunately, Captain Croix-Meyreville heard of it and had Vacher arrested and sent to a court-martial, which ended up sentencing him to 2 years in prison, a year for each insult. But let us return to the story at hand. After Barthas arrived at the 15th Company at 9 in the evening, The Poilus were relieved by a battalion from their own regiment. It turned out that the British relief had been postponed by 5 days. After a 2-hour march, they reached the town of Saint-Éloi, where they were given soup and coffee. But it turned out they would have to immediately set out again in the night to the town of Béthonsart, where they would be billeted. This journey to Béthonsart was terrible. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero, and gusts of snow blinded them. When the snow reached the ground, it froze immediately, making the road extremely slippery. Soon the battalion was completely disorganized. The exhausted and disheveled men leaned on sticks to try and ease the weight on their feet, which were being ravaged by the cold. Most fell behind and did not manage to arrive to their destination until the next day. Seeing all those exhausted men painfully moving through the snowstorm in the darkness of night made Barthas think of Napoleon's retreat from Russia. Luckily, he had a flask of 90% alcohol, from which he would occasionally take small sips, and which helped him keep up with the leading group of his company, commanded by Sub-Lieutenant Sévérac. They passed a town and were told they were only 2 kilometers to go until they reached Béthonsart, but those kilometers felt eternal. The group had to make a halt to try and rest for a moment, though they soon had to set out again because it was too cold to stay still. They kept marching and were discouraged. The bright snow let them see pretty far away, but still they couldn't see any sign of a village. The plain stretched out in every direction. Finally, they reached the village, but soon saw that it was the wrong one. They had lost their way, and were told that they were about 5 kilometers from Béthonsart. This was beyond demoralizing. Derisive whistles emerged from the ranks directed at their commanding officer. Barthas wrote that the sub-lieutenant was not a bad man, but he was far too meticulous and a stickler about rules, so he did not have the sympathy of the men. With the anonymity brought by the scattered ranks, the darkness, and the blinding snowstorm, many of the soldiers started hurling the rudest insults imaginable at the sub-lieutenant, and telling him to go back to school and learn how to read a map. Barthas wrote that the soldier who is certain of impunity can sometimes become unjust and cruel, and though he usually had a strong aversion against those who wore gold stripes and represented militarism, this time he did not approve of his comrades' behavior at all. Anyone could have made a mistake in reading the map during that cursed night, and no one else noticed that they had taken a wrong turn. The sub-lieutenant took all the insults and did not say a word. After asking for and receiving directions to get to Béthonsart, he simply gave the order to head out. Those who could, or wanted to, followed. Barthas wrote that somehow he still managed to follow the column and reached the town. They had all been promised a quarter-liter of coffee when they got there, but in that awful night the field kitchens had not managed to arrive yet, so Barthas simply wrapped himself in his blanket and slept in the corner of a big shed. It was 6 in the morning, and they had been marching since 9 in the evening the night before, covering over 30 kilometers. Of the company, only 30 men had managed to arrive together. The other stragglers arrived over the course of the day. At noon, someone woke Barthas to eat a bit of soup, but after eating, he immediately fell asleep again. They were all beyond exhausted, and they hurt all over. The next day, Barthas felt slightly better, and he went to where his previous company was stationed to get his pack back. Out of curiosity, he asked the sergeant major to see the register of punishments. He wanted to see what reason the captain had written to punish him. Barthas expected to read a masterpiece of literature, as the captain had a law degree and had held a staff post at the ministry. But the little message he saw was stupid for him. It simply said, "Barthas, charged with carrying out an order, said to his men, 'Just look like you're working.'" That was all. and Barthas was about to close the libelous register without giving it a second thought, when he saw an amendment signed by the commandant. "This corporal sets a bad example. He is unfit to serve as a non-com. There are a good number of candidates in his company who could replace him, to good effect. In consequence, I have the honor, Colonel, to ask you to reduce him in rank." Barthas wrote that those lines wounded and infuriated him. If they broke his rank because he lacked a military spirit, or because of his socialist and anti-militarist opinions, it would be a badge of honor for him, greater than the Croix de Guerre itself, as it would have been evidence that he had followed his principles in a time when many others had violated theirs. But what they had written that he set a bad example was too much. For a moment Barthas wondered if his poor stripes were worth stirring up all the trouble, but all his comrades in the 13th Company begged him to file a protest and offered their support. The other corporals even offered to turn in their stripes in protest. He dissuaded them of getting involved in it, but their support touched him deeply, and finally convinced him to ask for a hearing with the colonel. When he left the 13th Company, all hands were stretched out to him, and he saw tears welling up in the eyes of his comrades. It was a difficult farewell. They had been with him for a long time, some since their garrison duty at the fortress of Montlouis during the beginning of the war. He returned to his new company and had to postpone his hearing with the colonel as he was still in the trenches, but as soon as possible he would let his voice be heard. And so we reach the end of this episode. The soldiers have had to face freezing rains and snowstorms, together with all the injustices of their superiors. And, of those superiors, Captain Croix-Meyreville stands out head and shoulders above the others for his indifference, his narrow-mindedness, and his petty cruelty. An insecure coward with absolute power over others. And now, for refusing to send his men to work in daylight in front of a machine gun's sights, Barthas has been demoted to a simple private and expelled from his company, having to leave his friends behind right as the battalion is being sent to some unknown future, while foreboding news come from Verdun. Still, Barthas has decided to protest against the injustice done against him, and we shall see how that goes in the next episode. I'll see you then, and I hope you all have a good day.